Yeah, so you want to introduce, or do you want me to, Steve?
Why don't you go ahead? I'm a spectator almost from home.
Okay, I will tell you, when we transition from one talk to the other, mine to yours, there may be a little bit of a lag, okay?
You have to give me permission also to share.
Right, okay, all right. So I'm gonna share screen, okay. What I want. Technology. Yeah, I want to make this.
Hi.
It's in a presenter mode, which I don't really want.
Maybe.
Okay,
Okay.
Take off your headphones and I'll listen.
Sometimes I need them, sometimes I don't.
You sure?
okay, okay. Can you see that, everybody?
Yes. Yes, we can see it.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm going to just mute because some people aren't muted. Okay. All right. Okay, welcome everybody. Our topic today is the war in Ukraine. I'm going to start with the making of Ukraine and the origins of this war. It's a very complicated subject, and so I kept trying to shrink this down. And so I'm going to miss some elements that are really key to understanding why it is that Ukraine is a different country, has an independent culture, has a different history, etc. There's just not enough time to get into all the aspects of this complex story. Okay. All right. And now I want to go to the next slide. Okay. So here we have, whoops. Okay. A map of Ukraine. The areas in blue representing the Donbass, Donetsk, Zaporozhye areas
I cannot even.
that Russia, is fixed on taking to make Ukraine a landlocked country. I mean, anybody who thinks that the invasion was about toppling the regime and going for Kiev just isn't looking at the evidence of the army that went north from Kharkiv, and there was a key battle that I'll talk about a little later, which resulted in the failure of the paratroopers capturing the airport that would have allowed them to bring in transport funds. So nations are, due to both internal and external international events. They're not created in a vacuum. People just tend to look at what happened within the nation, but nations are formed by external events and external pressures. Okay, and Ukraine is different from Russia. Please mute. Ukraine is different from Russia and Belarus due to its different history. Nations aren't defined strictly on the basis of ethnicity. I mean, certainly this country would never become a nation. And one keeps hearing, well, they speak Russian. Part of Ukraine, which Ukrainians do, and I'll get into why and how that occurred. But if that was the reason for it, then why not Canada part of the United States like Ben Franklin wanted? Okay. So I want to start in a sense with Putin's 7,000-word article that he wrote in July of 2021, where he makes the argument that Ukraine is not a separate people, that it shares a 1,000-year history with Russia, that Ukraine is not a real state, that it was never a different people, that it's a fabrication of the West, that independent Ukraine poses a threat to Russia, that it's a Nazi state, that Russia, and this is something that one sees, one has seen for 200 to 300 years, that Russia is always a victim of the West. It resonates well within the Russian population. That Ukraine would pose a threat as a nation, as a NATO or EU country, and an Russian Orthodox perspective that the whole world is flawed and only Russia can save it because it's the true inheritor of the Byzantine Orthodox Church, which is the descendant of the Roman Empire with Constantinople. You have Ukraine, you have the Ukraine versus na Ukraine, and when Russians and Soviets wrote about Ukraine, they would use the na Ukraine, which is like saying the West of the United States. It's kind of reference to a territory belonging to somebody else, okay, themselves. And both under Tsarist, Soviet, and current Russian regimes, they want you to think that it's always been Russian. So you can't expect anything from a country that doesn't really exist. So people were surprised, not only in Russia, but in the West, that Ukraine actually was able to put up the resistance that it did, and it didn't just topple over like it was expected to. But this whole point is what, not only what defines Ukraine, but really what it is to be Russia. This is a war about what it is to be Russia, okay? Because even in Putin's own words, when asked whether Russia has any borders, he says, we have none, okay? Now, Kyiv, and I've spelled it in the Ukrainian way, and that's when it went from Kiev, which was the Russian way of saying Kiev, to Kyiv, is the beginning of the Rus story. The Rus are means rudders of ships, are Scandinavian Vikings that invaded Northern Europe. People forget that Normandy was formed by Vikings, and less than 2 centuries later invaded England. The Vikings, history has always been kind of minimized in the West, but the Vikings invaded and went down the Dnieper River, the Volga River, etc. They were looking for silver to trade with Byzantine, and in return give slaves, so they would capture people along the way and just sell them for silver, etc. And there were 4 different Rus areas. The least significant, and Moscow didn't even exist when Kyiv was the center of the Kyiv Rus empire, if you will. It was the least important, the most easterly, and the most subject to Asian types of influence, right on the border with Asiatic people. But from Russia's perspective, especially starting with the Orthodox Church, that Russia supplanted Kyiv when Kyiv was destroyed by the Mongols in 1237, and that they take over the story, so that it doesn't exist anymore. We've now taken over because we're the inheritors, et cetera, and you don't really count. But Ukraine's history is very long-standing, going back to the Scythians. The ancient Greeks wrote about it. The northern shore and hinterland was populated by ancient Greeks, Vikings, obviously with the Rus, Byzantium Empire, with which they were in close connection. In fact, the Kyiv king, it's on a timer, and I don't know how to quite stop it right now. It just I don't want to stop it because I'm. Any case, they were married into the Byzantine royalty and also the royalty of France. They're mentioned in the Icelandic sagas, the king of Kyiv, et cetera, et cetera. The Khanate of Crimea, which was the descending portion of the Golden Horde ruled that part of southern Ukraine and Crimea for several hundred years. Poland plays a key history of the Ukraine. Without Poland, there are no Jews. Without Poland, there is no basis for law. Without Poland, there's no habeas corpus, etc., in all of Ukraine, none of which exists in Russia. Lithuania is part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth history. I don't have time for it. And the influence of the Habsburg Empire that is in Galician part of Ukraine. And then there are still Greek communities that go way, way, way back, okay, to ancient times that still live in southern part of Ukraine. None of which is shared with Russia per se. Now, Moscow was under the rule of the thumb of the Mongolians. The Mongolians weren't interested in conquering them in terms of you now must speak our Turkic language, you must now turn to our religion, etc. They said, you must pay us tribute every year. And if you don't, we're going to come in, and they would, and knock whoever was in charge and put whoever was. But more and more, the Muscovy Rus fought alongside the Mongolians, and the Mongolians strengthened Moscow to be a border post against the Lithuanians that posed a threat to the Mongolian Empire. And it wasn't until 1480 when Ivan the Terrible had defeated and got rid of the Mongols and paying tribute, that the Mongolian Empire, if you will, starts to disintegrate in terms of the land surrounding Moscow. Okay. So when Ivan the Great, is expanding, he's also going into the west, but he's defeated in the area called the Livonian area, which forms Baltic states, because he wanted control of the Baltic Sea. Okay, and he's defeated there, and that's really key, because without that, the Poles, who were in an informal alliance since 1320, actually form a Commonwealth union where there's a Lithuanian king with the Polish nobility. And the Polish nobility really have the upper hand. They decide who's going to be the king. They keep demanding more and more rights. In fact, arguably, at the end of the 18th century, Poland has greater representative democracy than the US, where only 7% of the population were involved in citizenry, and the rights to vote there was 10%. And they had district Dietine, little parliaments, and the Sejm. And by the way, we get the filibuster rule from the Polish Sejm, where it was one man voting for filibuster could stop everything, which caused the eventual disintegration of that parliamentary system and the system as a whole. Moving right along, I just mentioned how Ivan the Terrible also starts with a private guard, the Obrezhniki, which later become the tradition of the Tsar and Stalin and the KGB and all these sort of terroristic forms of state power to wield against those who even serve you. Okay, so Ivan got rid of 10,000 plus, not poor people, boyars, people that he had given lands to and serfs, but then they didn't serve him and he got paranoid. So you're gone. It's paranoid phase. Whoops. Finally, by 1721, Muscovy becomes Russia. Okay. The land of the Ukraine was always seen as an agricultural land filled with peasants for the most part, and was a breadbasket. It's probably the most fertile land in the world in terms of for growing crops. Okay, Moscow saw it as a place to colonize. So when later later Poles and Russians divide Ukraine, you know, Russia taking the eastern part, mostly east of the Dnieper, and the Poles west, which they already had control over. It's during this time that you have the rise of Cossacks, who were non-Serb Ukrainians. Okay, they were out of the control of everybody, and the Cossacks fought with the Poles, then against the Poles, were decimated, okay, and went to the Tsar of Russia saying, we want to form an alliance. And the agreement that was made, which I'll refer to later, is referenced even by Khrushchev, okay? So to them, this hymnate of the Cossacks, tiny proportion of what's Ukraine, is the basis for why Russia says, well, Ukraine's ours, because you agreed to this, okay? You know, the Habsburg overlay, is, you know, in terms of the legalistic, more democratic norms of giving citizens rights. I know it was an autocracy in many ways, but there was certainly more rights and more of a legal system than you had under Tsar's rule in the Russian portion. So I'm moving ahead, okay? There was a Ukrainian independent republic from 1917 to 1921, okay? And no matter how hard others try to sublimate the will of Ukrainians to express themselves culturally, linguistically, and they are an Orthodox church that's pretty close to the Russian Orthodox, but not exactly the same, okay? They keep getting repressed. Now, in 1917, at the end of the war, there was the Polish-Soviet War, okay? And, you know, Polish troops go into Kiev, the White Army is there fighting the Bolsheviks, the Soviets go into Kiev twice, and, you know, the Bolsheviks finally end up on the Vistula, Warsaw, where they do not win, and they sign a Treaty of Riga establishing the boundaries between Poland and Ukraine and Russia. So the question becomes, why, if you believe in the workers of the world unite and the Marxist theory, etc., it's indicating rather the whole aspect and belief and ideology of nationalism. So why did Lenin and the Bolsheviks create a socialist republic of the Ukraine as part of the Soviet Union? Okay, because it was weak. They were afraid of whether they would even survive. Okay, and that you know, they thought they could sublimate it just like the Tsar, but they would give them, you know, some form of autonomy. And of course, there were Ukrainian Bolsheviks, you know, Communist Party that was significant in its power. Okay, the Ukraine's borders are formed as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, Treaty of Versailles, but really the West doesn't give a crap about Ukraine. I mean, they're not really focused on it at all. It's not one of the big issues of the Treaty of Versailles whatsoever. Only Germany recognizes Ukraine's international borders. And that is because at the last year of First World War, they invaded and captured the entire Ukraine and more in 11 days. Okay, why? They wanted Ukraine's as their breadbasket, their Kornkammer, okay? And the significance of that is that it affected the generation of Germans fighting the First World War, and they were told that this was going to save and cause the Germans to win the First World War because there would be food for everybody and food for the army and so on and so forth. And that concept of Lebensraum emanates from that invasion. Now they're kicked out when Germany surrenders, and it resulted in that Soviet-Polish war that the Soviets basically win. The Poles still very anxious about Ukraine because they were eliminated as a political state and actor between Prussia, the Russian Tsar, and the Habsburg Empire, and they're concerned that Russia is going to again obliterate them. So they're trying to cause some problems in Ukraine for sure. But also, there are 5 to 6 million Ukrainians living within the Polish borders, and there are hundreds of thousands, if not a million, Poles living in what's Ukraine. Okay, these things are not, they're complex. They're a result of international activity. So, in the end of that war, tens of thousands of Poles are killed, and Poland has gotten over that. Look at the visit of Zelensky to Warsaw this week. Okay, and that's a result of intellectuals, Polish intellectuals from the 1960s and 70s, and I'll get to it. So then I want to briefly talk about the Holodomor of 1932 and 1933, which was not recognized until actually all of the archives were opened up in the fall of the Soviet Union, and they were opened up even through 3 years of Putin's rule until everything was shut off again. But it gave access to all this documentation. And between 3.5 to 5 million people died in the Ukraine from forced starvation. And what was the purpose of it? To crush that peasant nationalistic core of Ukraine. That was the purpose. And he felt that what you had to do was to eliminate the kulaks, who were serfs who now had gotten land and were successful farmers and have become the mainstay of agriculture, both in Ukraine and in Russia and in Belarus, and to eliminate them by collectivizing. The Communist Party of Ukraine begged Stalin to stop doing this, and he didn't. And then he ended up killing more than 100,000 Communist Party members of the Ukraine. Okay? That was followed by the Great Terror. Okay? And hundreds of thousands, actually, and then during Khrushchev time, millions were sent from the Ukraine to Siberia. In fact, the Ukrainians formed the majority of the population to the largest cities in Siberia. Okay, and actually, parenthetically, in 1917, there was a green Ukraine on the coast, Pacific coast, by the Amur River that declared independence and was part of the Ukraine independent state, and it survived from 1917 to 1922. Okay, so Germany plays virtually no role until the 11-day war, but I've already spoken about the impact on Hitler. And then, of course, you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact, which, if you mention in Russia today, you're going to prison. Okay, it doesn't exist. In Stalin's time, after the end of the Second World War, if you talked about the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression, you could go to jail or worse. Why? Because Russia is the victim, even though they and Germany started the Second World War by invading Poland and splitting it. Imagine if Poland had not fought, just surrendered, England and France would not have entered the war. The United States wouldn't have entered the war. And Hitler would have taken what his primary goal, which was the deaths of tens of millions of people in what is Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and part of Russia, and settle Germans to rule over the farmers and have the Lebensraum. That was the primary goal. We've lost sight of that because the predominant story, and it's not an unimportant one by any means, it's Holocaust focused. And people actually, young people think that the whole cause of the war was what Hitler did to the Jews. He did not enter the war because of the Jews. We didn't even know what was happening to the Jews, even though some people want to rewrite history. We entered the war before the camps became operational mass murder sites. We don't talk about the million plus Jews that were shot, not gassed, shot, and just thrown into ditches everywhere. Because it changes the story. And it changes the story for Germany because Germany has taken on responsibility for the Holocaust in an admirable way, if there's anything admirable about it. But they've never taken responsibility for the fact that they fought an expansionist imperialist war and that was the main part of it. And if you don't face up to history, you're not going to be able to explain things to people. So very quickly, sorry. Hitler just copied what Stalin did and the Holodomor in terms of, I'm going to start people. When they captured 3.5 million Soviet POWs, many of which were Ukrainians, guess what? They were starved to death. 3.5 million, we're just not going to feed them. Just let them starve to death. Okay? Where do you get that idea from? Well, he got it from Stalin because he saw, hey, you know what? You can just starve people to death. Okay? It's estimated, nobody knows for sure, that 8 to 14 million Ukrainians died. Okay, they formed a significant part of the Soviet army. The cities were eliminated. Much of the fighting was done in the Ukraine. Now, the EU, its basis, its myth is that war is bad, peace is good, and that's the lesson of World War II. And all you have to do is trade, and there won't be any war, which is a good thing. So Germany is going to trade, especially with Russia, because that's a good thing, right? Okay. But I will argue, as have others, that ever since 1776, the major wars have been about anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. The United States frees itself in 1776, then against England. India is freed in 49. It loses its colonies in anti-colonial wars in the 50s and 60s in the Caribbean. And still, Northern Ireland issues relate to its imperialism going way back to the 12th, the 11th century. Okay, Holland loses Indonesia in 49, France loses Southeast Asia in the 50s, and then North Africa in the late 50s and 60s, and Spain and Portugal loses the remaining territories that it's had from its imperialist times from the 70s. So the only imperial state that exists is Russia. That is the only European imperialistic power not to emanate from Europe, but to go into Europe. The brutality continues under the Soviets. The Polish throw out this 5 to 6 million Ukrainians during the post-war period. You're out of here. You're not Polish. Goodbye. And a lot of Poles that are in Ukraine are kicked out, but most of them already been killed, to be honest. And Stalin, ironically, even though he's a Georgian by birth, says here's the paramount of ethnic groups, and Russia's at the top. Okay. And so with this dialectic conflict between Marxism and nationalism, we are going to support all these anti-colonial movements all over the world because they're fighting imperialism, except for anything that's close to Mother Russia, right? That's the mentality. So Tito, who's a virulent communist, right? They still try to knock him off because he wants to be free of the Soviet Stalin capture. They crushed the Hungarian revolt, okay? And later on, Dubček in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, it's all about Russian power. Now it's not even transparently ideological. It's just, they're ours, go away. Okay, we're not going to deal with anything. And as I mentioned earlier, the anniversary of Pereyaslav from 300 years prior to, so that's 15 or 1656. Khrushchev said, this is why you cannot be independent. And actually, under Khrushchev, when he's head of the Soviet Union, he brings up the Russian Valuev circular from the Interior Minister of Russia of 1863 that said the Ukrainian language never existed, does not exist, and will never exist. So there's a period of a lot of Russification. Now, not only could you not mention the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, you don't mention that the United States saved Soviet Union. People forget how much 11,000 planes under Lend-Lease from 42 to 45, 6,000 tanks. I mean, when you look at the sheer amount, it's staggering. And in today's value, it would be $560 billion of military and machine, the machine works necessary to create more military equipment. It would never have won without us.
And that went to Russia?
Yes, to the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It would not have survived. But the United States during Cold War wanted that history buried as much because we helped to preserve Joseph Stalin. Okay. So they always portray themselves as the victim, as Putin is doing now. And importantly, from the 60s and 70s, Polish leading intellectuals, and including and inviting Ukrainians, laid the groundwork for what's going to happen in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, 90s. And with the recognition that communism is going to fail and that imperialism is going to fail. Russian imperialism, Polish imperialism. It's when they tell the Poles, forget about Lvov. It's Ukrainian. Yes, it was Polish hundreds of years before, but forget about it. We have to go past it. And everybody, almost everybody, certainly in government, et cetera, accepts the idea, which is revolutionary. I just bring up a few things. Helsinki Agreement that everybody may remember was recognition of treaties, borders, and that nationalism is a human right signed by the USSR. Then things muddled along with Brezhnev, et cetera. You get, the Chernobyl meltdown, which is symptomatic of what has gone wrong with scientific Marxism and the progress to a future communism. But in the Ukraine, where the president Kravchuk in 1991, when the Soviet Union has collapsed, but it's not formally over. What causes it to be formally over is that Kravchuk, against Yeltsin demands, holds a national referendum where 84% of the population voted and 90% approved an independent Ukraine. It already exists as an autonomous state of the Soviet Union, but now it's going to be an independent country. Even the Donbass, Donetsk area vote in heavy majorities for independence. Okay, and 1 week later, Yeltsin meets Kravchuk and the leader of Belarus, and they sign an agreement that they can have a commonwealth, but it's the end of the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev speaks to the Russian nation the next week, and he's done. And what does Putin call that? The greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But putting this all in context, okay, so Eastern Europeans recognize that NATO is the only way to protect itself, okay? In 97, not that long ago, the Russia-Ukraine Friendship Treaty, there's a no invasion clause under any condition. There's a Bucharest Agreement of 2004 where Putin signs it, that in recognition for the borders, Ukraine and Belarus give up all their nuclear weapons. Okay? But for the Germans, right, we've atoned. We have to keep peace. Peace is the number one thing in our agenda. So we must trade with Russia to make sure that there isn't any war ever again. So we're going to do Nord Stream 1. And then we'll do Nord Stream 2. And you have the then Chancellor Schroeder, who called Putin a flawless democratic leader. Okay? Then in 94, just to go back a little bit, you have Kushma, who's, there's corruption, there's scandals, etc. And then the famous election of Yanukovych against Yushchenko. Now, Yanukovych was a gangster, pretty much, in the Soviet mold, and pals with Putin, right? Yushchenko wanted to integrate eventually with the EU and look to the West. You might remember how he was disfigured. What happened was the election was crooked. UN saw that it was crooked. The Ukraine Supreme Court said that it was a crooked election because Yanukovych was declared the winner. They held another election and Yushchenko won with 52% of the vote. Okay? That's Yushchenko before the dioxin attack that came from Russia and after. I mean, he's lucky he survived, but he was severely disfigured. But Yushchenko was disappointed because there was a lot of infighting. Paul Manafort was hired by Yanukovych. And at the last minute, Yanukovych ran on a platform, yes, we'll join the EU. Yes. A week before he's supposed to sign the pre-EU agreement, he doesn't go to Vilnius to sign it. Why? Because Putin told him, no, you cannot even say you're going to join the EU. That calls for the Euromaidan revolution. Now, the significance of the Maidan revolution is this. First, there's students out there, hundreds and thousands in the Maidan, the primary sort of central plaza of Kyiv. What happens? The Yanukovych, the gangster that got elected thanks in large measure to Paul Manafort, what does he do? He starts with snipers, they start shooting and beating the hell out of the students. He thought, well, the parents will keep them at home. But it was a shock to all Ukrainians. Why? It was the first time violence was being conducted against Ukrainians since they'd gotten independence. They thought, we're all Ukrainians now. We're not going to do this to each other. That was the shock. So instead of tens of thousands, it was hundreds of thousands. And it was being shown on TV in all Eastern Europe every minute of every day, live feed. Why? Because what people saw was the civic engagement, the organization without formal bodies organizing Ukrainians to have toilets, to have soup, kitchen, medical, all of this, and that they could create their own civic responsibilities on their own without it being applied by the state. Okay, that's the significance of it. And Eastern Europe saw that a big change had now occurred in Ukraine. Okay, so Yanukovych flees because the army won't intercede on his behalf. And there's an interim government. What does Putin do during the interim government? He invades, Georgia and invades Crimea. Okay, Crimea that had been under the Khanate of Crimea for 600 years. The fact is that Crimea that had been given by Khrushchev to Ukraine for both practical reasons, but also to appease Ukrainian feelings of nationalism. In any case, we know what happened. So what happens from 2014 to 2019? Poroshenko, who's president of Ukraine, is focusing on de-Russifying, which had been the intent of Khrushchev and the succeeding Brezhnev, to introduce more capitalism, obviously fight the separatists and Russian tourists in the Donbass region, and very importantly, to decentralize power. Okay, the Minsk Agreement, which is France and Germany, Russia says we're not a participant, we're just observers. They never signed it. It's not going anywhere. Okay, and 2019 is critical because it's not just that Zelensky, whose parents were Jewish, it's that it's a generation that's non-Soviet. These are now people that did not grow up under Soviet rule, and be in power. This is a generational change. So you have increased democratization, decentralization, much faster capitalist success. What do you think when the Russian troops went into Kharkiv and these places, they're stealing toilets? Because the economists and others think that only 48% of Russians actually have toilets. So the U.S. was perceived as being weak, January 6th, and the retreat from Afghanistan. So Putin invades, okay? And it's a shock to the world order. And it's a shock to not just Washington, but the EU, and they're telling Zelensky that we'll provide a plane for you because we didn't think it would survive, okay? Now, people forgot, Ukraine has 190,000 standing army, that it already had 1.5 million reservists who had fought along Donetsk and Donbass, okay? And there was full civic engagement. That's where everybody felt they were part of this battle, okay? Versus the elites, if you're educated, et cetera, in Russia, you don't go to the front. Engineers, lawyers, et cetera, they're not fighting the front. They are from Ukraine. Okay, so Russia captured 7% of Ukraine between 2014 and 22. It went up to 22% by March of 22, and it's around 17 or 18% today. And there was a key battle at the Hostomel airport, which was not even 25 miles out of Kyiv, where elite paratroopers were prevented from capturing that airport. And had they done so, the story might be very different today. The Russians had already gotten a government to take over with Viktor Medvedev, who had been, one of those defense attorneys under the Soviet system that basically agrees with the prosecution, you're going to the Gulag. Okay, and he was a friend of Putin. Now, Russian casualty figures are all over the place. I've seen some that say 130,000 killed, 200,000, on a conservative level, it's 70,000 killed to 130 to 180,000 wounded. 9,100 armored vehicles destroyed, 1,847 tanks, although the Ukrainians claim 3,240 tanks, and over 500 captured. Okay, there's over 2,300 infantry fighting vehicles and 70 aircraft, and let's not forget the battleship. Now, the example of the Battle of Vuhledar, where the Russians have been losing extraordinary. Everybody's focused on Bakhmut, but this shows the Russians haven't been learning, and they have top-down inability for command and control, and they don't have a system where NCOs are in charge of smaller units. They're just throwing people like in the First World War and the Second World War. They don't care. They don't care. Now, we estimated that there'd be 50,000 civilians killed. The Pentagon did. The figure is around 8,000, which is bad enough, and another 11,000 wounded. We don't know how many Ukrainians, but probably well over 100,000 killed and wounded Ukrainians. They lost anywhere between 450 and 700 tanks, and you can see the figures for yourself. 7.6 million Ukrainians have left Ukraine. Now, some have been coming back to the areas that were freed around Kharkiv, etc. The number of buildings damaged, you can see for yourself, 150,000. Schools, apartment buildings, educational facilities, dorms, etc., museums. So it's the last figure I saw from February was from the UN and the World Bank that to rebuild the Ukraine will be over $411 billion. I did see another figure that said 460 billion, but it's a lot of money. And in terms of U.S. and European aid, here you see 45 billion from the U.S. euros. It's people who claim that, like Trump said, we've given 150 billion dollars. It's total BS. And another thing is the Department of Defense has organized 3 audits already. Putin fired the head of the Ukrainian military because it had to do with lack of accountability for certain stuff. So, they are trying to be as accountable to the United States for every dollar received as they possibly can. So the questions that I have is this the last of the anti-colonial imperialist wars? And in 100 years, will people really be talking about inflation rates, bank crises, political partisan divisions, or even Trump? Or will they be talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and if it's a Ukrainian victory or defeat, how that defines geopolitics for the next 100 years? That's where I'm.
Thank you very much, Ed. Could you, let's
Yeah.
see,
Let me give me one.
yeah, I would like to share the screen myself. Could you allow me to share the screen?
I think you can.
And to those who come, I am very sorry I'm not there in person, but I tested positive for COVID yesterday, and I don't feel bad, or terribly bad, but it's just not a good idea to be there among you. And this is why I'm at home and going to give you my part of the presentation from here. I hope to be able to, well, certainly we'll be able next meeting of the Foreign Affairs Group. So could you give me the?
I think you can share.
Yes, I can. Okay. Let's see. What can you see there?
Hold on.
Okay, you can see.
I can see you, but I do
You
not.
can see the whole thing, right?
No. Hold on,
Okay, you can. Very good.
Wait.
Okay. What you can see is one page that says 1 year of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a recap.
Nope. Hold on 1 second. What do you?
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now we do full screen.
Okay, but it's just one picture, right?
Yep.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I will then. So the invasion occurred a little bit over a year ago, and frankly, the world has changed in that 1 year. There have been many consequences to this invasion, and we're going to go through a number of them here. The consequences of the Russian-Ukraine war. So let's start with the first one. It reinvigorated the liberal internationalism, which is the upholding of rules-based norms and the promotion of liberal democracy. It turns out that during the last 16 years or so, there has been an expansion of authoritarianism in the world. Look at Russia, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, Turkey, Brazil. But with this invasion, there has been a rethinking of whether that is a good way to go, even though the China has been selling the idea that authoritarianism is better. Is better because it can have longer projects, longer range projects. It can make faster decisions. It is quicker in implementation and many other positive sides. But because of the invasion, there is a second thought, and there are indications that there's a shift in the balance, perhaps back to the liberal internationalism. Another important consequence of the invasion, of course, is that it's a more powerful NATO. Only in 2019, Emmanuel Macron of France declared NATO brain dead, and Donald Trump threatened to quit NATO. And the truth was that most member nations did not live up to their agreements to spend at least 2% of the GNP in military things, in rebuilding militaries, even after the Crimean seizure by Russia in 2014. This is why Donald Trump threatened to not defend those countries that don't live up to their obligations of their 2%. So, but because of the invasion, there has been a very serious rethinking about this, and a reinvigorating again, and even expanding NATO. Western Europe's two biggest non-aligned countries, Finland and Sweden, they applied for membership. And 2 days ago, Finland joined. And by Finland joining the NATO, the border of NATO with Russia more than doubled, because Finland has over 800 miles of border with Russia. So this is a big deal. So NATO has become more powerful. They are spending at least 2% GNP in their militaries as promised, and some of them even more. Another consequence is that, well, the invasion exposed the limits of European military readiness, and also of United States military manufacturing. Europe was caught with their pants down because, well, they did not spend the 2% that they were supposed to in military readiness, and they were not ready. And they realized this, and now these problems are being addressed. Also, the military manufacturing has been found that it's not up to date, and it's not the right way of doing it. And this too is being addressed. One area in which this was very clear was in the tanks that Europe had offered to give to Ukraine. Europe, I think, offered to give them several hundred tanks, but when they were going to actually do it, they found they could not do it because some of these tanks were just not operable, because they were in the wrong place, because of many other reasons. So this is being addressed. Another important, and very important for the United States, consequence of the invasion is that the United States is again a world leader, easing the doubts about its commitment to Western security, the doubts that came up when Trump was president, because he chastised the countries, the NATO countries, for not spending enough in military power and relying on the United States for defense. So Biden has been able to unify the NATO countries, and also in the West and much of the world, against this invasion. Further consequences of the invasion: the notion that economic exchanges, trade, and interdependence are the best guarantees against war has been shattered. This was the reason for the formation of the European Union. The idea was that, well, if they trade, if they are interdependent from one another, they will not wage war. And this has been true in Europe. until the invasion of Ukraine. Gerhard Schröder, he was the leader of Germany. I don't remember exactly when, but about 10 years ago. He was a champion to bring in Russia into the Western oil and gas markets. And the main reason, it was perhaps a benign reason, was to make Russia part of this interdependence and therefore less aggressive towards any other country. This did not work. So it is clear now that military power is also needed. Further, the global energy trade has been changed completely and turbocharged the transition to alternative renewable energy sources. As you know, mostly Europe and the United States, they don't buy, or they buy less Russian oil and gas. This has been switched. The supply of petroleum and gas has been switched to United States and also Norway to a large extent, and weaning it off from Russia. But also a very important thing was, or is, that some countries, some members of the European Union, had viewed the green transition as something that was imposed on them by Brussels. They hated it. But now they see that this is a matter of energy security, and now they embrace the idea. So there's a good chance that they too will work hard at changing the energy system to alternative and renewable energy sources. Another consequence of the invasion is that we have a unified Ukraine and who has intensified its wish to belong to the West. Further, Russia has been severed financially from the world and heavily punished by sanctions. It is estimated, I can show you here, Russia's GDP, what they think, some organizations think will happen. Let me get at a closer view here. The OECD, the Organization of Economic and Cooperation Development, the rich countries in the world, they estimate that in 2023, the GDP will shrink by 5.6%, the World Bank by 3.3%. The IMF, on the other hand, predicts that it will remain stable, maybe increase a little bit to 0.3%, because of the stability of oil and gas exports. However, just last week, March the 8th, 2023, Wall Street Journal had this article, Russia's economy is starting to come undone. And it's a long article, but let me just show you this. The oil and gas revenue has really gone down, and it will probably go down even further. On the other hand, the budget has been tanking, and it probably will tank some further. And the economy in general has dropped and doesn't show signs of improving. So in turn, this means that Moscow deepened its economic dependence on Beijing. So Beijing now is in the driver's seat. It must be very uncomfortable for Moscow, as this is a reversal of roles. Just a couple of 50 years ago or so, it was the other way around. Now they depend on China. Another consequence, important consequence, is that it dispelled the myth that the Russian military was excellent. Well, Ed showed you the debacle on the casualties of war among the Russians. The loss of 10,000 vehicles and equipment, including about 2,000 tanks. When you compare that with the Russian invasion of Chechnya. In the first invasion of Chechnya, they only lost 767 vehicles altogether, compared to 10,000 in Ukraine. And in the second invasion of Chechnya, they lost less than 300 vehicles and equipment. Compare that with 10,000 vehicles. So it has cost the Russian military an enormous amount, but worse than that, the real problem is that there is no myth of an excellent Russian military. And the truth is that it will take decades, if not generations, for trust to be restored between Russia and the West. And there are more consequences of this invasion. It weakened China's option to invade Taiwan. China is studying very carefully what is going on in this invasion of Russia to Ukraine, and taking notes and see if it applies and where it applies and how it applies to a potential invasion of Taiwan. Furthermore, this invasion became an opportunity to test new weapons. For example, drones. It seems that this war is a war of drones. Unfortunately, the possibility of nuclear war, however remote, is no longer as low as it was before. There is a chance that if Russia loses this war, it can do something stupid. It is possible. And finally, the war has become much about Russia's regime survival as it is about the survival of Ukraine. If Russia loses this war, the regime is gone. That's the estimation of many people who know about this. So with all of these consequences, then what is next? What is expected to happen? And for this, I have read a person called Ben Hodges, who is a retired United States Army officer who served as a commanding general of the United States Army Europe. And he's in policy analysis, and he seems to know his stuff. He believes that Ukraine will win this war. And that he also believes that that will be followed by the disintegration of the Russian Federation. But the more immediate issue is what's going to happen next. Well, he thinks that taking Crimea is basic for Ukraine. He says, if Ukraine takes the Donbas region, not much happens, nothing much changes. But if Ukraine takes Crimea, Donbas will follow. So taking Crimea is basic, he thinks. Without it, Ukraine will never be safe nor prosperous. Why? Well, because of the military entrenchment of Russia in Crimea. The Black Sea Navy is there, Russian Navy is there. And a Russian Crimea will threaten Ukraine militarily, in the shipping, and its commerce, and its everything. So this is what this person, Ben Hodges, believes. But specifically, what does he think is going to happen next, in the next couple of months? Well, he believes that there will be a counteroffensive from Volodar to Mariupol by the Ukrainians. What does that mean? If you can see my arrow here, Volodar is here, and his thought is that the counteroffensive by Ukrainians will go down here and will go all the way to Mariupol. This is Mariupol, dividing the two sections dominated by Russia right now, and eventually moving towards Crimea, and eventually taking Crimea. So the next question is, well, how will this end? And for Russia, they have stated more or less that it will end when they control the 4 oblasts that they have annexed, plus the Crimea that they annexed in 2014. What does that mean? Well, that means this. These are the 4 oblasts that they annexed into Russia, and of course Crimea. So what they're saying is that once they secure this area, the war is over. The problem is that they don't control large portions of that area. Compare this, which is the official barriers or the borders, with what is the line here of dividing the 2 armies. Well, they evidently do not control everything. So, and what is the ending for Ukraine? Well, for Ukraine, Russians have to be gone from all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. That is their position. All right, so those are the 2 extremes. What is possible? What could possibly be the ending of this? A or B, or a probable ending? Now, this is my personal opinion. I don't know anything about this except what I read, but my opinion is that a possible ending is that Russia takes Bakhmut, they declare mission accomplished, they sue for peace, a ceasefire is declared, negotiations begin, and they never end. So just last week, Lukashenko, Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, Russia's closest allies, called for this, specifically this, exactly this. And Russia responded, well, not yet. That's what they said. So I think that this is quite possible. However, there are other opinions. As I said, the general, like I quoted, his opinion is that Russia will lose the war. And if it loses the war, the disintegration of the Russian Federation into many different countries is likely. Don't forget what Ed said, that Russia today, the Russian Federation, consists of many, many different groups of people and 100 and some languages, in fact. With this, I open the session for discussion.
Thank you, Steve. So just make sure the mic is turned on, and you just need to pull the switch up behind you. There's a top piece that's got to show green. You push it towards.
Are we on?
You need to push that button up.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline?
Nobody knows, but probably Ukraine, a group from Ukraine, but nobody knows for sure. Any comments, questions? I don't. From what I've read, 2/3 of the military equipment that we have provided to Ukraine, not including artillery shells and bullets, 2/3 has come to Ukraine between January of this year and March. And that Ukraine is training new and reconstituted divisions. And the issue over Bakhmut was not to use up the growing reserve contingencies that are going through this intense training, because they want to use it for the counteroffensive, and that has been the goal of the Ukraine General Staff. And some of them actually argued, just give up Bakhmut, it doesn't really matter. But Zelensky overruled that, saying that it had become the Alamo, so to speak, and they couldn't. So even though the Wagner Group, through everything that it's got, and it's the head of the Wagner Group, so very critical of the Russian military, because it doesn't have enough shells and bullets, etc. And they have taken extraordinary losses that they haven't taken Bakhmut. They have thrown everything but the kitchen sink at it, and they haven't taken all of it. So I have a feeling that while the West's support for Ukraine in terms of popular support has been declining, that will be changed very quickly, especially in the United States, if they succeed in taking back a lot of land. Because the Americans just like being on the winning side. It's like,
Yeah, but I believe that the West will try to convince Ukraine to accept the ceasefire, and Ukraine will have no other option but to accept the ceasefire. Now look at what happened in Korea. In Korea, it is a ceasefire what we have there. We don't have an armistice, we don't have anything else. We have a ceasefire and negotiations going on for 70 years. And this is a face-saving situation for Putin. And if he achieves the ceasefire, I suspect that he will remain the president of Russia. But if he loses, he won't. So I think that this is a good chance that this will be the outcome nearby.
What is the role of China as a middleman, or maybe in their own interest? What is the role of China in all this?
Well, I think they're terrified of the potential instability of Russia. Like Steve said, if Russia even loses face to such a degree that Putin is kicked out, Russia is a federation of 15 states, actually 85 quote autonomous regions, and the fact is that for China, it terrifies them just like the fall of the Soviet Union. They do not want to have this huge border with a country that is unstable and could go any which way. So they will support, but I think Blinken said, don't you be sending weapons because you'll be crossing a line here. That there's no indication that they have sent much more than some drones.
And Macron is talking with Xi, and he has mentioned that maybe China could be a good intermediate here in order to achieve peace. And I think it is true. China has, as I said, the power over Russia to pretty much tell them what they should do. And I think that if China is really serious and want to stop the war, they could do it with the support of Europe for a ceasefire. And this is why I happen to believe that the ceasefire is quite possible.
I disagree, because for Ukraine, a ceasefire just gives time for the Russian army to recoup. And for the Ukraine, this is existential. It's existential. They have to, and I think they will win back not everything. There's the estimates that I've seen, 20% chance of taking back all of Donetsk and the Donbass region. But we don't know that, imagine a similar counteroffensive that took place in August and September, and you have the collapse of the Russian army. And if you have a collapse of the Russian army, people forget the revolution of 1905 in Russia, was because of the disaster to the Russian naval and military forces against Japan. That caused the 1905 revolution that in many ways portended the revolution of 1917.
Mhm. No
Anybody?
more comments?
Go ahead. You got to talk into the microphone, Mr. Kamaji. And I know you've read stuff about this.
Yeah. Yeah, in a very real sense, any kind of ceasefire is basically a win for Russia because they get to keep the territory, and then it's also constitutes a permanent threat to Ukraine because they could come back as this was earlier said, they could come back and try to conquer it again. So I don't know what would be the optimum. Really, the optimum would be for the unfortunately, from my perspective, would be for Ukraine to join NATO, which is the one thing that Putin utterly opposes. But I mean, after all this, it's the only way that it has sort of a deterrent, as far as I can see.
Yeah, the argument that Putin used that that NATO posed a threat, in my mind, is completely spurious for one reason and one reason alone. Is that you have Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, members of NATO, which under Article 5, if they're attacked, that everybody else has to join in, are within a day's drive of St. Petersburg. Okay, so the whole argument was specious. It's typical Russian historiography. We're the victims. They're out to get us. We're the only people who can save the world. This has been going on for hundreds of years. It's very difficult to get out of a certain mentality if that's what's been beaten into you from czars or the other forms of leadership. And Russians believe it.
Yeah, that's the other thing. That's the thing about it. People think that this is okay. People think this is all related to the Soviets. It's not. I mean, the Russia was wanting to be the dominant world power for centuries before we before the Soviets took over in Russia, and they still want that. I mean, it's still the the history of the so-called Great Game in Asia, where they basically had this contest between Russia and Europe over Asia. I mean, it's a very unfortunate situation, but you have to have some sort of a realistic deterrent to stop this stuff, because if you let it go on, I mean, in my opinion, even if they do this ceasefire thing with Russia still controlling a large swath of what was formerly Ukraine, then there's no security for anybody, because they'll be back, and the Russians could very well come back. They sit just across the border, so it's very easy for them to come back anytime they want to.
This is why I try to show the history within the context of imperialism and anti-colonial wars that start in 1776 and went through. And it's last imperialistic country. Now, people accuse the United States of imperialism. Now, how do we define imperialism? Well, it's classically by taking colonies and taking other ethnic and cultural groups and imposing your culture, your religion, your everything else, on those people. I mean, India was, part of the British Empire. So what's the lingua franca of India? How do people communicate amongst all of their groups? In English. Okay. We may be accused of a form of economic imperialism, but we cannot be put in the same grouping as English imperialism, French imperialism, Spanish imperialism, etc. Because we never did that. The only place we did it was the Philippines, which, you know, many people were against in this country, and we got out of it. And Puerto Rico, okay, where we said, you vote for independence, we're gone. And the 2 votes that have been taken, no, we don't want independence. You know, so
But can we take credit for that when we really weren't a country until
for what?
Well,
You need the
countries-
mic. You need the mic.
all these countries existed. I mean, France, all the empires, you know, but you kind of look at that, you had all these empires existing before. So we come over here, right, the Pilgrims start America, I guess, over here, if you want to say that. It's not like you're busy starting your own country. You haven't gotten to the state to be able to colonize the world like the British Empire and the Dutch.
Well,
Yeah, 13 times. So it's like, I just feel like I don't know if that's a great excuse to say that we never did that, we never did that. Well, if we existed probably prior to the 1600s, it's probably possible we would have done the same thing.
you know, we did, you know, and we are confronting only recently our history against indigenous people, etc. But, you know, most indigenous Americans died because of disease. Okay, I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, there's so many scientific journals and books written on the topic that, you know, Latin America may have had 150, I mean, from Latin, the entire continent of the Americas, including Central America, may have had 150 to 300 million people. In Mexico was definitely, Mexico, Guatemala, the whole Central America was definitely around 55 to 70 million people. And after 50 years, there were barely 1.5 million people left, according to the census. And they didn't go around exterminating. People just died because of, you know, the viruses that the Europeans had been exposed to and developed resistance, and the survivors had the resistance to these viruses, which, you know, even today, you go into the Amazon, people are forbidden into certain areas. They have absolutely no resistance.
Well, you know, imperialism now takes a different form. You don't have to go into the country to get their resources. You could get their resources by just sending your large companies into those places and getting their resources. And by TV, you could influence the culture. So there's no point going into places. But when we talk about imperialism and we think about, did we support the imperialists? Did we support the South Africans when they wanted to carry out their apartheid? Did we support the people in Rhodesia when they were imposing their imperialism? Did we support all of those Western countries who are now looking to the East and calling the East imperialist, when it was that same country that was supporting the people who were being oppressed at the time, giving them arms to fight off the imperialists?
Except in their neighboring country, where they were killing them.
But what I'm saying is that in Africa, since I'm an African,
I get it.
I could relate to all of these countries. If we think about Ethiopia, when Italy said we want to go in and take over Ethiopia, what country defended Ethiopia and sent arms to Ethiopia? So when we're gonna start painting with a wide brush talking about imperialists, first we must look at ourselves.
What I try to argue is that you know, that there's been an anti-colonial history since 1776, and all of them have been won by the anti-colonial and a traditional imperialist set. This is the last imperial nation that is fighting an imperial war in the traditional imperial definition, if you will, that is on the verge of losing. And I think Steve was absolutely right in mentioning that if they lose, then Russia falls apart because it's an imperial country.
Yeah,
Ed, you mentioned the gigantic amount of the United States provided the Soviet Union during World War II Lend-Lease program. Were the Russians supposed to pay back that, or was written off?
It was written off. It was written off. And you know, again, not to deflect or say anything, you know, when Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union included 4 million men, 6,000 tanks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, 600,000 vehicles and over 600,000 horses. You know, even Stalin thought the game was up, that the Soviets were destroyed. He was surprised. You know, he went into hiding in his Dachau for a week after the attack. And only when the resistance was shown that he, you know, he was told, you've got to come back. You're the only person that can keep this together. Okay. But the United States, if you just look at the sheer amount, the railway lines, the locomotive engine, the railway cars for transporting equipment, it's just an unbelievable amount. Imagine 11,000 airplanes. It's just phenomenal. But what's even more ironic is at the end of it, they don't talk about it because they don't want to make it look that they're indebted to the United States. We don't want to talk about it because we can't admit that we helped out Uncle Joe.
The other thing is, I don't know if anybody caught this, but I think it was like this last week that the papacy finally renounced the doctrine of discovery, which you know was used to justify a lot of the things that were done to the Native Americans. You know, when we talk about the general idea of imperialism, and as far as foreign imperialism, it's like, you know, the United States is not really a major international player until about the turn of the 20th century. You know, that's just the way it was. But even back in the time of what the Chinese refer to as the Great Humiliation during the 19th century, that the U.S. had what was called the open door policy, which meant they wanted our share of it too. I mean, we're not necessarily going over there and fighting the wars, but we want our share. We want our share of exploiting the Chinese too. So we've been in on this on that aspect too, because it's not. We weren't major players in the international imperialism, except to the extent of supporting European powers. A lot of European powers that were, like France in Vietnam. But we have never really been major players on that outside of the Americas.
Right.
So,
We didn't need to be.
so,
You know, we didn't need to be. And I'm not saying that the United States is guiltless about stuff, but you know, by definition, we weren't an imperial power in the true sense that gives imperialism real meaning. So people then say, well, it's economic imperialism, et cetera. We set up a world order. The shock to the system by Russia's invasion was they were going, the world's order, the UN, you know, treaties. I just showed some of the treaties that they had signed with Ukraine, saying with a specific no invasion clause, recognition of borders, et cetera, et cetera. You know, all of it. So either we go back, you know, to the law of the jungle, where might makes right and so on and so forth, or we have a system that has some kind of international body framework where things can be, by and large, regulated to prevent wars. I mean, if Russia, it's catastrophic.
This is where why there is a swing perhaps back to the idea of liberal internationalism.
A question here. Oh, sorry. No. There are some people who compare what's happening in Ukraine with what happened in Iraq. Oh, are they different? How are they different?
Well, you missed a good chunk of how I showed you.
I was.
Yeah. Okay, but so, you know, Iraq, I argued at the time, having lived in the Arab world for many years, that this was one of the worst mistakes the United States had ever made. Okay, so we thought we could impose democracy on a landing culture far away that supposedly posed an existential threat to people around it. Okay, it's unfortunate that Saddam Hussein felt the need to inflate his capacity to do injury to his neighbors, primarily for one reason alone, to prevent Iran from creating mischief, more mischief. Okay, he'd already fought a war in which more than 1 million Iraqis have been killed and several million Iranians have been killed. Okay, he wanted them on their back feet because Iran is a much bigger place with a much bigger population. And what did we succeed in that war? To give Iran entry into Iraq as the major dominant external power. And so for Russia, I go back to the fact is they still use the same argument that was used in the 19th century and before. There is no Ukraine. They don't exist. They're just little Russia. It's ours. Forget about self-determination. Forget about people's rights to their own nation. Forget about all that. Yeah, they're ours.
But you're saying, I'm saying as far as going into a country without having the UN sanction it, is there a difference between what we did in Iraq and in Syria versus what they are doing? That's what I hear people arguing. I don't know.
No. In terms of the United Nations waffled. Okay, it basically waffled because we provided misinformation about them having yellow cake from Chad and all that nonsense. Was nonsense. Okay, and I think it was terrible. But the United States did not go to say, Iraq belongs to us. They don't really exist. It's ours. Let's just take it. We went in there thinking, oh, this is a bad man. He was a bad man. He killed a lot of his own people, no doubt. He's a bad guy. We take him out. We're going to put somebody, and they're going to become a democracy, which is ridiculous.
Didn't Paul Wolfowitz say, oh, this will pay for it, all the oil that they have?
Yeah,
Didn't Paul Wolfowitz say that the oil that's in Iraq will help pay for all this?
it's all terrible. Yeah, you're right. I mean,
So we did go in there with the idea that we would appropriate some of that.
well, no, that it would pay for itself, which was nonsense. The thing is, the first Iraq War, when Herbert Walker Bush said, you can't invade a country, Kuwait,
Right.
and we got the coalition together. And did we take over Iraq? No, because it was the right thing to do, because we understood, or they did, that Iraq is very complicated. If we upset things, it will be a disaster. Okay. Kuwaitis did pay for all the expenses of the United States. Wolfowitz is an awful human being that he and Dan Pearl have been active in the Middle East since the 70s and actually helped to tank the Oslo Agreement and ensure that Bibi Netanyahu won the first time. These guys have a vision that is not in conformity with most reasonable Americans' opinions. Anyway,
Well, ladies
so-
and gentlemen, I
Thank
think we better close for today.
Are you going to mention China for next month?
Yes, I was
Okay.
going to do that. Next meeting will be next first Thursday of May. I forget what day it is, but we're going to talk about the US and China. That's a topic that keeps on recurring, but it's a very hot topic, and it is very interesting. So I hope I will see you all next May for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, and I hope you feel better, Steve.
One thing, Ed,
Yep.
thank you very much for your participation and for running the program. But do not turn off that computer because it takes about 15 minutes after you stop recording. It takes about 15 minutes to translate the recording within the computer.
Okay. Well,
So
hope-
stop recording, but do not close the
Will do.
laptop.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Happy Easter and happy Passover. That's not really